By now, Robert's brain had become a mass of confused and racing thoughts. His doctor felt that Robert would have the best chance of living a happy, fulfilled life if he was kept sedated as much as possible. Robert tried many prescription drugs for this purpose, but the side effects from these were too severe, including one that made Robert's hair tremble, and another that caused him to forget all the letters in the alphabet after G. It was finally discovered that the only way to calm Robert's brain patterns was for him to listen to nothing but Perry Como records. Within one day, actually it was one song, and it was a rather short one, Robert's brain activity had almost flatlined due to Como's soporific phrasing and complete lack of vocal excitement. Well, eventually, Robert was able to branch out and listen to other types of music, such as Frank Sinatra, Bing Crosby, Lawrence Welk, and within reason, Julio Iglesias. Even today, his narrow musical upbringing has resulted in him thinking that the Carpenters and Kenny G should be considered thrash metal. And it's true that the mere sight of a drum kit can cause a rash to form on Robert's chest, often in the shape of Elmer Fudd. At this time in his life, Robert was going through a gawky stage, and he hopes to be out of that stage by the time of his 60th birthday. Although Robert claims to have been excellent in sports, his definition of excellence needs some clarifying. True, Robert was always the first boy chosen on the school baseball team, but that was simply because he was so short that his strike zone was half the size of a baseball. So he always walked on 4 pitches. Well, he walked on 4 pitches until the other teams realized they couldn't do anything but give him a base on balls, so the pitcher saved 3 pitches by throwing directly at his head, so he'd get the first by being hit by a pitch. Which not only sped up the game, but it was more fun for the other team. It's possible that Robert's color blindness resulted from the fact that over a 6-year period, he was intentionally hit on the head by 3,247 baseballs. Robert went to San Diego's Marion Catholic High School, home of the Crusaders. Robert will sing their school song for you later. He was still keeping to himself most of his time, although he did have an imaginary friend who had been with him since grade school. Unfortunately, his imaginary friend decided to go to the prom with somebody else, and that pretty much put an end to their relationship. The advantage of being such a loner was that Robert didn't waste his time on silly, unimportant things that most kids waste away their lives on, like going out on dates, being invited to parties, hanging around with friends, learning about life, and having fun. Believe it or not, in 1980, Robert ended up being listed in Who's Who in American high schools. Not because he did anything noteworthy, but simply because nobody knew who the hell he was. They found themselves asking, who is that? Robert managed to score very well on an IQ test. And not only was he deemed the highest in creativity for the entire state, but he was also chosen as the 2nd highest in logic. That was the beginning of the end of the IQ test, as far as being deemed any kind of accurate measurement of anything. One good thing to come out of high school was that Robert was unanimously named most likely to suck. By the time he was a young adult, Robert had never held a real job in his life. When his classmates were mowing lawns, babysitting, and delivering newspapers, Robert wasn't allowed near motorized equipment, definitely not anywhere near young children, and he had no concept of what a newspaper was. Never one to care much about current events or what's going on in the real world outside of himself. It's always fascinating to hear Robert's answers when you ask him difficult questions like, do you know who the President of the United States is? Or where is Asia? Now, we all know we would not be here were it not for Robert's artistic career. Well, truth be told, we probably would be here anyway because of the free drinks and food. In art, Robert found his most important escape from the real world, especially after the price of Yago sangria nearly doubled at the local convenience store. Robert had been toying with the idea of spending his life as an artist, as he knew that some of the most famous painters had been abject failures while they were alive, and they barely earned a cent. Robert felt that becoming unsuccessful and living in poverty were goals within reach. Even though he was now painting more than ever, his adolescent efforts were almost childlike. They were sort of a combination between Henri Rousseau's primitivism and 1970s Popeye cartoons, the ones where Bluto and Popeye can fight for 6 minutes and only 5 drawings are needed. Robert was inspired by the nightmarish Gothic images he saw in horror movies, and his paintings soon took on a darker tone. However, it was eventually discovered that the real reason for this dark tone was because his television's picture tube was almost completely burned out, and it showed little brightness, resolution, or detail. Robert's dark renderings had already become an ingrained and inescapable part of his style. Specializing in murky browns and grays, the art world eventually gave Robert the nickname Mr. Bleak. Robert did a lot of self-portraits during this time, as he had heard that many famous artists had also done their own self-portraits. What Robert didn't know was that these artists didn't paint themselves as live subjects. So every one of Robert's self-portraits was of the artist painting himself while looking at a painting of himself painting himself. This led to a period in Robert's life when he was dizzy for 3 straight years. Robert actually graduated from college with a BA in computer science, an amazing achievement considering that to this date he still has no concept of how to forward an email. For quite some time, Robert's artistic skills hadn't shown much growth, but to be fair, this was mainly because his brother Louis hid all of Robert's art supplies. It took Robert 3 years to find them because Louis hid them in a newspaper, and that was the last place Robert would ever be for anyone. But Robert didn't sit still during this time. For the next 3 years, he focused on collecting cell animation drawings as well as 16mm films. And if you haven't seen Robert's cell collection upstairs, it's quite amazing. Although he basically uses that hobby as an excuse for collecting frames from Fritz the Cat and other pornographic animation movies. Robert's art eventually began to get better once he was able to remember that most human beings have only 2 legs and their ears are on the sides of their head. Robert's style quickly began to solidify, much in the way that leftover Jell-O forgotten in the back of your refrigerator will start to solidify in a few months. And speaking of which, in the hopes of finding some commercial work, at one time Robert had submitted some artwork to Kraft Foods, the company that makes Jell-O. But they sent him a rejection letter that simply stated, "Jell-O isn't gray." By now, Robert had been doing some work as at a cancer patient ward, and through this he got to meet many celebrities who would end up having important influences in his life. One was Frank Sinatra, and this meant a lot to Robert, because as far as he knew, Sinatra was the only Italian in history who became famous without having to kill another human being. The great entertainer Sammy Davis Jr. also became Robert's friend. Robert had painted a landscape for Sammy, and it was one of the first paintings he ever sold. Sammy thought it was one of the most marvelous things he'd ever seen. The fact that Sammy happened to be looking at the painting through his glass eye didn't seem to bother I can't look at you. Robert was now focusing on drawing some of his favorite monsters that he saw in horror movies, seemingly unaware that he was engaging in copyright infringement by trying to make money off things he didn't own. Although it's possible that he was unaware of the concepts of licensing and intellectual property, it should be noted that he'd already encountered a similar problem in the past when he tried to sell his then young niece Beba to a friend. At the time, Robert's excuse was that he needed the money to buy new brushes. An important influence on Robert's artistic career was legendary horror actor and renowned art collector Vincent Price. When Robert told Vincent of his desire to become a professional artist, Price looked at the lad's work and realized that if Robert became an air traffic controller, a bus driver, or anything that required clear and critical thinking, he was likely to kill a lot of people. So he figured Robert could probably cause the least amount of harm by becoming an artist. After all, the only painter who ever did any serious harm was Hitler. paint more and more and to never stop painting. This inspired Aragon, as he took it as a voice of encouragement, even though it turns out that Price's thinking was that if Robert flooded the market with low-quality art, as a result, all the paintings in his own collection would soar in value. Robert has told me many times, Vincent's most important advice to him was to never go to art school. Not because he thought it would affect Robert's style, but because he knew and liked most of the good art teachers in town and didn't want to inflict Robert on any of them. The next important step in Robert's artistic evolution came when he went to a horror movie convention, and Sarah Karloff, the daughter of acclaimed star Boris Karloff, noticed Robert was trying to sell unlicensed paintings of her father's image. Rather than sue him, she felt sorry for him due to his ignorance, which included the fact that Robert thought that the bolts on the side of Frankenstein's monstrous neck were not a part of the creature's makeup concept, but were actually a permanent part of Boris's head. Through Sarah, Robert got introduced to other descendants of people he had committed similar property crimes against. And they all felt similarly sorry for him. But they allowed him to keep painting the subjects they owned. The main reason for this was because they realized it would be almost impossible to prove copyright infringement in court because Robert's renditions looked nothing like the actual that he was trying to paint. In fact, when the Cheney family was originally considering suing Robert, they realized that what Robert had drawn didn't look like any of the 1,000 faces of their illustrious relative. Robert was going to enlist the help of top Hollywood attorney Bela Lugosi Jr. To fight any infringement charges against him until Bela Jr. discovered that Robert was also violating his property rights.